So, here we are on the 12th of April, the day on which we would have left the European Union without a deal and had to conduct trade on World Trade Organisation terms. Of course, now the EU has accepted Theresa May's call for an extension, and we're getting 6 months, up till the 31st of October, for a spooky Halloween Brexit. So, there's another twist in the tale. We ain't out the woods yet. It could happen earlier than October the 31st, because that is only the deadline. But I think we're all assuming it's not going to. We're going to go right up to the deadline again, I'm sure. I think it's worth at this moment, when we were going to leave but actually aren't, to explain the core reason why I would like us to, and why I voted leave, why I stick to that position in spite of how it's been handled up to now, and why, when I say the core reason, I really mean the larger, longer-term reason, without getting bogged down with shorter-term factors that can be resolved dynamically. I know people who say EU law as it is better than British law, and that the fact that a bus campaign lied about statistics means the whole thing should be redone again. But to me these things are really rather petty, and they don't cut to the core of the issue. Ultimately it comes down to the fact that the EU, before it even was the EU, when it was called the European Economic Community, which itself emerged from what was called the European Coal and Steel Community, was sold to the British public as a financial economic pact, and not a political one. Over time it became what many of its advocates wanted it to be from the beginning, which is a political supranational organisation. And many of its advocates today want it to go even further, because they wish for it to become a kind of federal superstate. There is simply no way that the EU, which has constantly been changing to become more political and more centralised, is going to just stop going in that direction randomly. So ultimately, our referendum on being part of the EU is not a referendum on the current state of the EU, but on its future. The Maastricht Treaty didn't exist until 1993, the Eurozone wasn't formally established until 1999, and the Treaty of Lisbon didn't exist until 2009. The EU is constantly evolving, and yet it always evolves to take more political power away from its constituent states. It started as a form of steel and coal protectionism, then evolved into a frictionless trade zone, then a political entity, and then it took monetary independence away by creating a central European bank and creating its own currency, which we thankfully did not adopt. And then it began to legitimise itself democratically by trying to lay down its own laws with its own federalised system. So to me, the referendum on the EU is not about specific bits of legislation. It's not about who wins the race to the bottom between the EU and the UK when it comes to internet censorship. It's not about immigration, and it's not about economics or trade, but about politics and sovereignty. All those other things are important. It's true that issues such as the lack of legislative initiative in the EU Parliament matter, but this doesn't mean that the EU could be fixed by adding more of the features of national democracies. I don't want a superstate. I want the place that makes legislation to be in reach of the people. Geography matters. Imagine 50 years from now, when the French presidency is reduced to some sort of provincial governor and national democracy has gone completely supranational. Could the Yellow Vest movement threaten a character like Macron then? What would it even mean if the true seat of power was in Brussels? It's much like when countries try to challenge multinational corporations, but they can just move. Supranational governance is supposedly one way to solve that problem, but when government becomes unrooted from the land it actually governs, the scope of action that the government can safely get away with becomes much, much larger. In 1968, there was another great uprising in France, a communistic one, so not my thing to be sure. But at that time Charles de Gaulle evacuated for a brief period because things looked so dire for his government. However, there's absolutely zero chance for a modern peasants' revolt when your own government is just a puppet and the string pullers are far, far away. The EU does not look like that today, but I assure you, it will. You can say that this is rather lurid or fantastical, but I think this is the larger scope of things, and when you look at the trend towards centralisation that the EU has already undergone, you wouldn't blindly assume things will just remain how the Treaty of Lisbon made them in 2009, and that the EU has reached its final size, its final state of perfection. I personally don't even think it's going to be called the EU forever, There was a time when they wanted Turkey to join, and the only thing that stalled that was human rights. Is Turkey in Europe? I think that in the long run they'll grab whatever they can, and just as the European Union wasn't always the European Union, it will become something else, some kind of intercontinental union. Wouldn't that be wonderful? There is such a thing as a state that's too big, and not just in that libertarian sense of big government that intervenes too much, but in the sense of a state that covers too large a territory and has too many subjects. And there's no way to fix it with more democracy. If it's undemocratic, it's a tyranny. And if it's democratic, then the interests of the UK are completely swamped by the mass interests of other nations. At some point in this larger process, you have to say no. And this is where I'm putting my foot down. You can argue the toss about the economics. If we're inside the EU, we get tariff-free trade with EU countries. But if we're outside the EU, then we get tariff-free trade with the other countries of the world. Whether that works well for us or not can only be determined dynamically by what percentage of our economy is dependent on Europe versus the rest of the world, and how well we are able to shift to different trading partners, at least when we are considering the long-term picture. Actually, one bright side about the delay that has now been agreed upon is that if we get no deal, and we are trading with the rest of the world under WTO rules, companies will have even more time to prepare and make different trading partners to prepare to deal with the effects of the EU external tariff. Of course, it also gives Theresa May time to force MPs to vote on her absolute capitulation deal, and we'll see if voting on it another 70 times changes things. So, that's the downside. But if you're one of those people worried about the nitty-gritty stuff and you think that Brexit somehow equates to Tory government, or however that fallacy works, I think you can be more and more assured as this drags on that Brexit or not, Labour are more and more likely to be our next government. It could be that this drags on forever until we decide to stay in anyway. But if so, then the second best option to Brexit is to subvert the EU from the inside, and we should try to do everything in our power to twist it towards Britain's interests and away from those of the other countries. The only acceptable European Union is a new British Empire,